Now, many people might not necessarily know about Biafra, so that's what we're going to kind of explain in this video. As always, we're going to go through the history, we're going to go through the context, but before we get into all that, don't forget to hit the like button, also share and subscribe, etc, etc. But now we'll kind of just get straight into that, so sorry about the little plug just then. So, with regard to Nigeria, first of all, the thing to understand is that it's got many different ethnicities, right? As a matter of fact, it has over 300 of them, right? So most of those ethnicities, if you combined all of them up together, would make up roughly about a third of Nigeria's total population, right? So Nigeria's population is predominantly made up of 3 different groups, right? So you have in the north, you've got the Hausa, and they make up about 25%, although people often say that the Hausa and the Fulani, because the Fulani are very similar to the Hausa, they make up, combined they make up 28%. Then you've got the Yoruba, and they predominantly are in the southwest of the country, and they make up 21% of the total. And then in the southeast, you have the Igbo, and they made up 20.5% of the total Nigerian population. So you see that the Hausa, they make up about 70% of like the northern region. You have in the southwest, you have again almost like 2/3 or 70% of southwest being controlled by the Igbos, and then in the southeast, it's about 2/3 or 70% again made up of the Igbo, right? So with all that, this sounds like a recipe for unity and peace and all that stuff, right? No, that's why we're doing this video, right? Because from 1967 to 1970, there was something called the Biafran War or the Nigerian Civil War, depending on like what stance you take, right? Before kind of getting into all that, we're going to need to step back a little bit and look at like the whole region itself and like the deeper history of it, right? So first of all, obviously, with these different groups, you have, they're set up in different ways, right? So in the north, you tend to have, they tend to be Muslim, and so the societies there tend to be quite theocratic. So there's a big emphasis on religious teaching rather than kind of like quote unquote Western teaching. That's why like the terrorist group Boko Haram literally means like, Western education is forbidden. Like that's basically what it means. So with regard to that, that's kind of how to look at the north. So for instance, it has a Sharia law. So just as an example, homosexuality in the southern part of Nigeria, you end up getting, I think it's something up to like 10 years in prison, and even for advocating for gay rights, you can get imprisoned. Whereas in the north, you just get the death penalty for being gay. So a little bit different, right? But anyway, so that's kind of how the north kind of governs itself along kind of Sharia like law kind of lines, right? Now, in the southwest, so you had the Yoruba, and they tended to be kind of authoritarian, So you had kings known as Obas, or my pronunciation is going to be really bad, just bear with me, people, it will be really bad, right? So you had like the Obas, right? And they tended to, they were like kings and stuff, and like they tended to rule the lands that the Yoruba are controlled, and also they tended to be more like native religions, so like kind of so-called animists. So those are the kind of religions that you can kind of describe in the southwest. Now in the southeast, where the Igbos are, well, at a later stage they tend to be much more Christian than the west, and certainly more so than the north. But their society tends to be a lot more democratic, right? So it interested me a while ago. There was a teacher and they said, oh, democracy is like a Western invention and stuff. It's, it's a sign of like Western imperialism, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, so the Igbo had like democracy completely independent of like Western influence, like literally centuries before it ever, so what are you talking about? Okay, well, like, so so like the kingdom of Nuri, so that was from at least like the 10th century, and so you had an elective monarchy, right? So people chose who their king would be, right? And that's how that they governed. So it was very much a kind of it's far less like hierarchical. It was a lot more democratic, a lot more pluralistic, etc., right? And so obviously in the north, you had a lot more emphasis on piety, and that's kind of like what held you in high regard in society. Whereas in like the southwest, it tended to be more cultural, it tended to be like artistic, it tended to be musical, etc., etc. But for the Igbo, it tended to be more on problem solving and also entrepreneurship, right? So the self-made man, that was what the Igbo society kind of like looked towards. And as we'll get into a little bit later in the video, there's many parallels between the Igbo and the Jews, right? In the sense of both groups were hated for being basically middlemen, for being like merchants who would go to other parts like of outside their own regions and be business people, and this caused a lot of resentment, a lot of hostility, and a lot of envy to the local people, right, who were not as wealthy as they. Now, something to note about Nigeria in the period before colonization is that, so in the north you had the Sokoto Caliphate, and this is basically, you know, Muslim empire, and basically what they end up doing is they end up warring a lot. They had jihads against different local groups because they wanted to spread Islam. And also as well, tied up within all of this, Africa just in general took part in the slave trade. So obviously slavery has existed in all different parts of the world, but in terms of, you know, African slavery, in terms of it spreading outside the rest of the world, obviously you had many people from North Africa and stuff, and like from Arabia who would take slaves. But then on top of that, of course, you had the Europeans who engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, right? And it's estimated that about 14 or 15% of the slaves who were brought to the New World by the Europeans came from the Biafra, right? So the southeast of Nigeria, you know, so like this region, which predominantly made up of the Igbo, this is where many of the slaves end up coming from, right? Because, you know, the kingdom of Nri and like all the other different tribes and like kingdom that they had there were not necessarily as strong as some of like the larger empires and stuff. So when they would be captured in war and stuff, they'd be sold to the Europeans, right? And so of these millions of people who were transported across the Atlantic Ocean, about 2/3 of those who came from Biafra, they were put onto British ships and they were sent to British colonies. Yeah, so many people who are African American, many people who are Afro-Caribbean, many of them, their ancestors would have come from Biafra, right? You know, so fast forward now quite a few centuries and stuff. Obviously, with regard to the slave trade, so the Europeans tended to just go to the coast and just be like, hey, like sell us like some slaves, and then people further in the interior would go and get the slaves from different tribes and from war and stuff, etc., right? But what ended up happening with the abolition of slavery is that, well, first of all, obviously with the abolition of the slave trade. So first of all, you had the West African Squadron, which is you know, the Royal Navy basically sending ships to break up the slave trade. So it wasn't just that Britain stopped the slave trade, also stopped other people from having slaves as well. And so as it was kind of like hunting down more and more smugglers and stuff and slave traders, what ended up happening is they ended up taking more and more territory on the coast of Biafra, right? And just the whole kind of coast of Nigeria in general. So the British ended up taking control over a large part of the coastline. And so, yeah, that's kind of how they got established in Nigeria, and like they had their kind of first foothold. So now fast forward later on into the 19th century, and you have the Scramble for Africa. Now, as we've mentioned in other videos, Scramble for Africa, it had less to do with like different like resources and etc., and it had more to do with the kind of geopolitical rivalry between the different European powers. So the French, for instance, they wanted to have control over all of West Africa. And so the British, in response to this, was like, right, we have this territory here along the Nigerian coast. So what we're going to do is we're going to move further north, and we're going to take as much land north as we can, right? So this meant that the British end up coming into conflict with the Sokoto Caliphate, and in, I believe, 1903, they end up defeating them, right? So now you have the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria, and you had Protectorate of Northern Nigeria, and it's named after the Niger River, which goes through Nigeria, right? So as a result of this, you have two colonies where the British were like, let's think about this, right? So in the Bengal, when we discussed like, you know, the partition of Bengal, like in our video about the partition of India, right? So the problem in Bengal in 1905 was that you had too many people over too large of an area, right? And so the British, for administrative purposes there, split the territory in half. In this case here, you had the opposite problem, because if you've got like southern Nigeria, which is very prosperous, very like rich and stuff, yeah, like, you know, great tax revenue, etc., highly educated population, etc. So you've got all that, and it has a coastline. Meanwhile, you have northern Nigeria, which is landlocked, not many educated people, not great emphasis on like kind of secular education, and also you have more indirect rule because like you allow basically the local emirs to basically run it all and stuff, right? So as we discussed in our previous video as well, you know, the British had various different levels of control that they had in their colonies. So for some places they would have a lot of direct control, in other places they kind of let local rulers kind of run things. But in the north you had a large budget deficit because it was hard to collect taxes from like these emirs, and also the north just wasn't very prosperous in the first place, right? So what they decided to do is, right, if we combine these two colonies, you know, we have one colony for the price of two, and then what we can do is basically, you know, use some of the tax revenue from the south to fund like projects in the north and stuff, then the colony as a whole kind of makes more sense. So that's what the British kind of did, and that's how they kind of viewed it. However, they didn't take into consideration all the different ethnic groups, all the different religious groups, and what tensions this would cause at a later stage. Now, the unification of the two Nigerias, yeah, this took place in 1914. And then in 1923, you end up having the first elections in Nigeria, right? Yes, as we point out with the India video as well, the British Empire in many of its colonies allowed there to be elections in which some of the locals could vote. And obviously, the franchise was restricted to only property holders or who had a certain amount of money, etc., etc. But still, they ended up having elections and stuff, right? So they had a series of elections going all the way through, and then the one that's like the year just before independence, right? So independence is 1960 for Nigeria. So by the time we get to the final election during this colonial period, you can already start to see that the different political parties in Nigeria vote basically along ethnic lines, right? So in the southeast, you had the NPNC. I can't remember all the acronyms and stuff, right? But the NPNC, they are in the south. In the north, you end up having the NPC, so the Northern People's Congress. I remember that one, see. And then you had the southwest, which was the Action Group, which was the AG. So, you know, so you got Igbos who are predominantly voting for the NPNC. You've got Hausas who are predominantly voting for the APC, the NPC, and then the Yorubas are predominantly voting for the AG. So it's all a little bit of a mess, and people are not voting along political ideologies as you would for most other parties. They're voting along ethnic lines, right? Which is not really a good recipe for harmony and peace and stuff going into independence. And one of the things that annoyed many of the Southerners was that in terms of them getting independence, right, the Northerners were more hostile to the independence movement because they was like, well, hold on, we're going to end up losing our power. If there's a unified Nigeria, then the central government, the federal government is going to tell us kind of what to do. So Nigeria got its independence with the proviso that the North would be able to kind of govern itself, right? However, many of the policies which the North ended up pushing through was basically what in America you'd call affirmative action, right? So basically having policies where when it came to hiring civil servants, when it came to giving government contracts and stuff, in the North, it went almost exclusively to other Northerners, right? Now, the reason for this is because, as we kind of said, like, the Southerners, especially the Southeasterners, tended to have a larger emphasis on education and on like kind of more secular kind of institutions and stuff, right? So they tended to disproportionately be represented in like the Northern like governments and like within their business kind of interest stuff, right? So you can understand where they were coming from. However, this ended up leading to more tension because it's like you're purposely discriminating against people who are coming from the south, especially from the southeast, right? And as we said before, there was lots of hostility towards the Igbo in particular because like they were seen as kind of parasites. They see, all the same kind of tropes that you see with the Jews wherever they've gone. You end up seeing the same thing with the Igbo, right? So it didn't help that a few years later in 1966 there ended up being a coup. Where like the leaders of many of the different regions end up being killed and stuff, right? And the leader of this coup was an Igbo, right? Now the fact that this coup was then crushed by an Igbo didn't really help still, because this myth, this kind of poison that the Igbos, they control the business, they control this, etc., they're trying to take over Nigeria, right? So this kind of conspiracy theory spread throughout the whole of Nigeria, right? And and end up being pogroms against the Ibu. So up to 30,000 Ibus in northern Nigeria end up being killed. So as a result of this, people in the southeast became very scared, right? They became very like worried that like kind of this new Nigeria wasn't going to protect them, wasn't really going to be here for their interest, and was actually going to be dominated, because obviously don't forget that most of the population resided in the north, right? So for fear of being second-class citizens, many people end up feeling that they needed to get their independence, right? So Colonel Ojukwu in 1967 declared unilaterally that Biafra was independent, right? Now, the fact that there isn't a country called Biafra today should tell you about how that conflict ended up going, right? So this is now talking about the Biafran War, or as other people might call it, the Nigerian Civil War, and this went from 1967 to 1970. But this conflict is a very confusing one, and so in order to explain this, I'm going to have to explain some other things about like the wider world and like decolonization and stuff, right? So hopefully by the end of that, you'll understand this conflict a little bit more and how it kind of relates to like wider geopolitics during this period.